Good evening and welcome to APTN National News. I'm Brittany Hobson. Yesterday we showed you a video of a violent confrontation between a security guard and a woman outside a grocery store in Saskatoon. People who saw that video have condemned the actions of the security guard. APTN's Priscilla Wolf met with one of the people that recorded the incident and has this story.
Starla Fiddler was making a trip to the Saskatoon Freshco grocery store when she noticed a woman being held down inside a van in the parking lot.
It would have been close to maybe 3:45, I believe I had arrived there. When I got out of my car, I heard a bunch of screaming and yelling, and when I came around to the front of the store, I first saw a woman inside of the vehicle, and there was a man on top of her, and she was screaming for help. I had no idea what was going on. The man was in his regular street clothes, so I kind of assumed that maybe it was an assault taking place.
Fiddler's partner called police, and she started recording. It turns out that the man was a security guard for the store.
I'm just trying to do my job.
We called the police, and then when we got a little bit closer, the woman was screaming for help, and the man was screaming that if anybody intervened, they would be receiving an assault charge.
Fiddler didn't know how to help besides recording.
With so many murdered and missing Indigenous women, that was my first thought, was to think that. And as an Indigenous woman myself, I do know that if someone had come up behind me or anything, I would have fought the exact same way that she was fighting, because I really didn't know what was going on. He didn't have on any security guard like clothing.
Police were called and the woman was charged with theft under $5,000. The Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations Chief Bobby Cameron says the security guard should be charged with assault.
This sorry excuse of a man, whatever his name is, would he have done that to a non-First Nation woman? Never. Not a chance. It probably would have been less of an incident.
The owner of the Freshco released a statement yesterday stating he is no longer using the security company at his store. Regarding charging the security guard, the Saskatoon Police Service sent APTN this statement today. We do not have any updates at this time. As with any call for service, we respond with the information we have at the time. As more information becomes available, that becomes part of the investigation. This is where we are at right now. And I can add that if we need to seek an opinion from the Crown following the investigation, we will. Priscilla Wolf, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
Despite the Yukon territorial election taking place on Monday, the final results are still yet to be determined, thanks to a tie in the territory's least populated riding. Here's APTN's Sarah Connors with an update.
It's been an unusual election week here in the Yukon. On Monday, voters headed to the polls and results were expected to be announced earlier this week. But 4 days later, and there's still no clear winner. Here's a breakdown of why that is. There are 19 seats in the Yukon legislature, and a party must win 10 seats to hold the majority government. The NDP only won 2 seats, while both the Liberal Party and the Conservative Yukon Party both won 8 each. So now, the tiebreaker depends on the riding of Vuntut Gwich'in and Old Crow in northern Yukon, a fly-in community of only 200 people. It's there that the Liberal Cabinet Minister Pauline Frost and NDP candidate Annie Blake are tied with 78 votes each. Now a judicial recount and a drawing of lots will soon be taking place, meaning the 2 tied candidates' names will be put into something like a hat and one pulled out to determine the winner. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
On Wednesday night, Iqaluit announced their first case of COVID-19. Today, that number has jumped to 13. Last night, the government of Nunavut announced that Iqaluit's Storehouse Bar and Grill was a spot of a potential COVID-19 exposure, and that anyone who had been there since April 8th should self-monitor for COVID symptoms for 14 days after their last visit. The first positive case was traced to a Canadian North airline worker who was a part of the critical worker exemption, which means they didn't have to isolate for 14 days to enter the territory. Nunavut's health minister says that doesn't mean the exemption is failing.
We have gone over a year with the critical worker exemptions in place without a case of COVID-19. Our territory relies on critical and rotational staff for everything from food supply and healthcare to critical maintenance. Without this program, we would lose vital services and put Nunavut at risk.
Mark Miller's press conference was supposed to be COVID-related, but he was asked what might be in Monday's federal budget that would be of interest to Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous Services Minister said he couldn't give out details about next week's federal budget. However, he recognized that COVID has created a hidden pandemic in the form of a mental health crisis, and he said poor housing and poor health in Indigenous communities go hand in hand.
Overcrowded housing causes tuberculosis to spread. It causes COVID to spread. It drives up the R rate and makes it impossible to drive it down under 1. And despite this, communities have done so. So clearly, looking at obviously shovel-ready infrastructure, and we have a sense of that, and housing, which is key.
Time now for our first break. Coming up, why some Mohawk groups in Quebec are concerned about a new housing development. Development is on the brain in Quebec as the province works to find its financial footing following losses during the COVID-19 pandemic. But by streamlining assessments during the rush to build, ancient Indigenous sites could be destroyed and their artifacts lost to history forever. Here's Lindsay Richardson now with a closer look.
We nicknamed it kind of Noah's Ark.
It's called the Rousseau Forest, but the ladies of Green Collective, Pincourt Vert, have their own name for it because it's teeming with life.
So this is the first size in spring in here. They're all emerging under these.
Except a few years back, it was almost destroyed by residential development.
I don't know what I can do to save the world, but I helped to save this little forest.
Sheila McNally was focused mostly on eco-activism until she took an Indigenous Studies course that changed the game.
I really saw how that is part of the community, this idea of stewardship, this idea of looking after the land, and how Indigenous communities have been guardians for centuries. And I look at my culture, look what we've done in 100 years.
McNally reached out to APTN when she got word of another potential development site nearby.
I thought, here's a great opportunity to make amends. There's an archaeology report that's saying there's evidence of an ancient Indigenous community there. What a great opportunity to turn and say, we're going to hold off.
And so this is what's going on. It's a huge land grab.
In early February, the municipality of Notre-Dame-de-l'Île-Perrot and Quebec's Ministry of Culture both received copies of an archaeological notice regarding this wooded lot near the banks of the Outaouais River. Rare, near-extinct trees grow here, and it may be the site of a prehistoric Indigenous community. But the plan is to clear it and build 17 homes. Dynamiting is already underway. APTN's messages to the municipality's mayor went unanswered. Across the water, in Ganawage, Mohawk Council says they're also still trying to set a meeting.
To me, it's all rooted in what I often tie things to, which is doctrine of discovery worldview thinking. Okay, that somehow or another the settlers have a right to occupy, exploit, do whatever to lands which did not belong to their ancestors.
Montour says other Canadian provinces, like Ontario, have power to stop development on privately owned lots if there's an Indigenous interest. However,
in Quebec, it's a different kettle of fish, I'm afraid.
Earlier in the pandemic, Quebec tried to pass an economy-stimulating bill that waived the requirement to assess and consult with First Nations before approving a project. The thing is, these potential historical sites are everywhere. Some experts say there are hundreds in Quebec alone. For example, up the river in Hudson, there's an even larger development on a potential Indigenous site.
There's something about looking at water that allows you the long vision, allows you to focus your eyes on a far, far place. And that's why this is so important to me.
Councillor Jim Duff has been coming here to Sandy Beach since childhood. Now it's the planned site for over 200 private residential homes. Despite his efforts, Duff says there's no real way to stop it.
You have a choice. You either buy the land at whatever price the seller wants to charge, or you let them go ahead and build.
The planned development at Sandy Beach sparked protests, especially from those who've studied it.
From the perspective of an archaeologist, we are literally losing and destroying sites every single day to development. Specifically in the case of Quebec, the situation has been disastrous for years. I mean, it was bad to begin with. It can only be worse now.
But Sandy Beach isn't just a potential historical site. Artifacts have been recovered there.
It was a metal detectorist, a guy who used to like to go to the beach and look for coins and rings and things that people had lost. And in the process, he found a couple of arrowheads. There was also some metal artifacts. It was an axe. There were some pieces of copper kettle. There were at least one stone tool. It was made out of a material that comes from very far north in Quebec, and it shows that people were trading and, there was movement back and forth.
Burke says archaeologists can register a site with the Quebec government in case it comes up for development. But that doesn't mean the government will stop it, because
they can decide that finding just a couple of objects on the surface does not constitute a site. Most of the time, we're just going to probably, sweep aside, especially Indigenous history, Indigenous archaeology, in the name of development. I've seen it just pretty much every single time. The ideal, of course, is to have First Nations archaeologists who will really look out for their own rights and their own heritage.
Right behind me, you can see the lands of the Ganyankahaga, the Mohawk Nation of Ganisadagi.
Ganisadagi Grand Chief Serge Simon says he played at Sandy Beach as a child.
The most dangerous individual to the governments is a First Nation with education. It's more dangerous than a gun.
The Mohawk Council of Ganisadagi only just became aware of the Sandy Beach file, but they're no stranger to the archaeological issue.
The mayor of Oka, who says we've only been there for 300 years when the priests arrived, not true. Those pottery shards are the proof that my people were there for over 2,000 years.
They raised the question of rights and title during development in nearby Oka.
When you find pottery, arrowheads, bones, you have to look at our history is intricately linked, and there's no getting around that. So you destroy our archaeological sites, you destroy also part of your history as well.
One of the issues is that we really need somebody other than developers to step in and do a thorough study of this report and before it's completely lost.
Back in Rousseau Forest, the ladies of Pincourt Vert say they're ready to continue pushing to preserve the site in Ile Perrot and the other sites beyond it.
It's not like a life-saving COVID vaccination clinic they're building. It's not an education center. It's not a hospital. It's not a place for homeless people. It's 17 homes for rich people. What's the rush?
The message is very simple: respect all life.
We asked Quebec's Ministry of Culture to provide comment or context in this situation, but they did not respond to our request before deadline. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
Here's a look at a story we are working on. Métis leaders in the Northwest Territories want transparency from the Housing Corporation after $60 million intended for projects sat idle for 2 years.
I'm Charlotte Morit-Jacobs. Federal funding could have been the answer to the North Slave Métis' need for elders' housing. Everything to turn this into this. Instead, their application was dead on arrival.
It seemed patently unfair that the Northwest Territories was being left out of this funding pot.
We'll look into who's slipping through the housing money cracks and what can be done to make it right. That story coming up soon on APTN National News.
Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. Today's photo comes from Hamilton Harbour along Lake Ontario. Returning birds are nesting and eggs are now appearing, which can result in some great photos. Be sure to keep your distance and don't put yourself or the birds in danger. Keep your photos coming by sending them to share@aptn.ca to be our next photo of the day. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the east coast, 7 above in Halifax, 5 degrees in Fredericton, 3 in Nain, a mix of sun and cloud, and 6 in Happy Valley Goose Bay, 9 above in Quebec City, 12 in Montreal, 13 degrees and cloudy in Toronto and London, sunny skies and 11 in Thunder Bay, 3 in Big Trout Lake, in northern Manitoba, sitting at 0 in Churchill, 5 above in Norway House, sunny skies and 11 in Gimli, 12 above in Brandon, in Saskatchewan, 15 in Swift Current, 12 degrees in Yorkton, 7 in Larage, and -2 in snow in Stony Rapids. In northern Alberta, 16 degrees in Peace River, 17 in Grand Prairie, sunny skies and 18 in Red Deer and Edmonton. Over to the west coast, sunny skies and 23 in Penticton, 18 in Vancouver, 20 in Smithers with sunny skies, 20 above in Prince George. In the Yukon, more sunny skies and 9 in Mayo and Dawson. Over to the NWT, -2 in Yellowknife, 9 above in Trout Lake, 2 in snow in Colville Lake, 7 in Fort McPherson. In Nunavut, -12 with sunny skies in Baker Lake, -10 in Chesterfield, -12 in Arctic Bay, -13 in Resolute. A Manitoba author is being acknowledged by the list of all book lists. Tasha Spillett-Sumner, a Cree Trinidadian mother, made the latest New York Times bestsellers list for her children's book, I Sang You Down from the Stars. The book is illustrated by Michaela Goad. You can find it in most places you buy books. We caught up with her at home and she had this to say about this big honor.
Hi everyone, my name is Tasha Spillett-Sumner and I'm the author of I Sang You Down from the Stars. And this is my daughter Isabella. When I found out that we were top 3 on the New York Times bestsellers list, I was absolutely thrilled and super excited about what this means for all of our children. I'm happy that our children can reach for books where they see us and our communities and families reflected in dignified and beautiful ways. Thank you for reading.
Congrats to that. Human trafficking is a big industry right here in Canada, and Nova Scotia has relatively high rates compared to the rest of the country. Trina Roach looks at why in this week's episode of APTN Investigates, Exploited. She joins us now. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us today, Trina.
Thanks, Brittany.
So Nova Scotia made headlines just this week for human trafficking. Why is this such a big issue?
You know, it's an issue in Nova Scotia, but one that people don't typically, talk about or think about or associate with the province. We think of Nova Scotia as scenic views and small rural communities, but trafficking is a big issue. And in 2018, there was Statistics Canada put out a report that had Nova Scotia really high on the list relative to the rest of Canada, like beating out cities like Vancouver and Toronto. And a lot of people were really surprised at those numbers. But there's a long history of trafficking here. And I think, I talked to RCMP Corporal David Lane, and he said it's a hidden epidemic, but one that happens out in the open. And so I think sometimes our misconceptions about what trafficking looks like is why we don't necessarily see it, right? So we think of like the Hollywood version, someone's drugged and abducted, but often it's very manipulative, right? People who are exploited might not even see it that way. They might think of the trafficker as their boyfriend. But Nova Scotia, like when I talked to Lane, he said, he could call another police service elsewhere in Canada and say, hey, do you have anyone from Nova Scotia there? And like Scotian traffickers, they're called, or Scotian girls, and they'll say, yeah, we do. Like he could pick up the phone any time. So Nova Scotia is kind of known as like an exporter of girls along these like highway corridors. And part of it, I think, he explained it like, because of the level of manipulation with trafficking, you know, if you are luring a victim and you're sort of promising them this glamorous lifestyle in downtown Toronto, as he said it, that's not necessarily, you know, if you live in downtown Toronto, that's not going to appeal to you. If you're from a small town in Nova Scotia, that might work. So there's a lot of factors at play and why it's such a problem here in Nova Scotia.
And when you're looking at the issue, I mean, how does trafficking impact Indigenous women?
You know, there's so many vulnerabilities. I mean, first of all, anyone can be a target and anyone can be a trafficker. That was a big message that I heard in a lot of the interviews that I did for this doc. So I want to say that up front. But when you create vulnerabilities, you know, traffickers can exploit those. So for Indigenous women, you know, when you look at like mental health, addictions, homelessness, you know, overrepresentation in incarceration rates and in child welfare, those are all factors that make Indigenous women more vulnerable to trafficking. And then that issue tangles into like missing and murdered Indigenous women and other issues. It's also tied to the whole history of colonialism. And Karen Bernard, who is with the Jane Paul Center and which serves Mi'kmaq women at risk. I mean, she goes right back to Pocahontas, right? And we sort of have this romanticized version of that story. You know, we've probably all seen the Disney movie, but she was a young girl who was, you know, forced into a child marriage, who was exported and taken away from her country. And so you sort of see it right from the get-go with colonialism. And so it's tangled with a lot of things for Indigenous women, which continues to have an impact today in a very real way.
Okay, well, thank you. That's all the time that we have today. A lot to unpack, but we'll be able to see that tonight on your doc.
Thanks, Brittany.
You can catch Exploited tonight right after our newscast on APTN Investigates. Today marks 21 years since APTN National News hit the airwaves, known back then as Envision News. It was the first time a national newscast was dedicated to sharing the stories of Indigenous peoples across Canada, and it was put together by an Indigenous television crew. From the start, APTN has strived to tell stories of our people, whether it's reports of starlight tours or missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, truths that are important to Indigenous peoples. And over the years, APTN News reporters and the stories they've shared have won numerous prestigious awards. So happy 21st birthday to APTN National News. Many thanks to you folks, the viewers, for joining us here each evening. While I've only been here for a short period of that time, it's been a pleasure sharing the stories of our peoples. Looking forward to the next 21 years. I'm Brittany Hobson. That's it for this evening. Stay tuned. APTN Investigates is coming up shortly.